200 inmates watched the morning the big man finally got what was coming to him. Nobody cheered. Nobody said a word. They just watched Razor Rollins, 6'3", 250 pounds, the undisputed terror of C Block, stumble backward for the fourth time in 90 seconds and hit the concrete yard with the kind of sound that travels through a man's chest before it reaches his ears. He hadn't been punched. Not once. The quiet man standing in the middle of the yard had his hands open, relaxed at his sides, his breathing slow and even in the cold morning air. Rollins looked up from the ground and saw something in the quiet man's eyes that he had never seen directed at him before. Nothing. Not anger, not triumph, not fear. Just the calm, operational absence of all three, like looking into the eyes of a man who has long since solved a problem you didn't know existed. It was the last morning Rollins controlled anything. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Marcus Webb arrived at FCI Haverfield on a Tuesday in November, transferred in a white transport van with two other men and no conversation. 35 years old, a gray prison-issue jacket 2 sizes too large, and a paperback copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations with a spine cracked from repeated reading. He walked the intake corridor with his hands loose and his eyes moving. Exits, blind spots, sight lines, threat vectors. 11 years of conditioning. Old habits from old wars. Marcus had spent his late 20s and early 30s as a hand-to-hand combat instructor for the United States Army's Combat Applications Group, Delta Force. His particular gift was the science of human movement, how bodies generated force, how joints transferred load, how a 200-pound man's momentum could be borrowed and redirected by someone half his size if the geometry was exactly right. 7 years teaching that science to some of the most dangerous men on earth. None of it had mattered when the prosecutor stood in the Fulton County Courthouse and told the jury that Marcus Webb was a trained killer who had beaten a man half to death outside a bar in Atlanta. He left out the knife. He left out the second man. The security camera footage that would have shown both had been logged as corrupted by a detective who owed the prosecutor a significant personal favor, a detail no one would discover for 4 more years. 15 years. Aggravated assault. The gavel came down and Marcus Webb's life folded in half. He made one private vow in the first week, sitting on his bunk in the dark. He would never use what he knew again. Not in here. Not for any reason. He kept it for 11 months. C Block at FCI Haverfield ran on a simple economy. Fear. The man who printed the currency was Deshaun Rollins, Razor. Former professional MMA fighter, 41 years old, built like a structural column, second-degree black belt in Kyokushin karate that he treated less like a credential and more like a loaded weapon. He controlled C Block through a straightforward system. Pay or hurt, commissary, phone time, bunk assignment, all of it ran through Rollins and his crew. The reminders for non-payment were physical and public because the public nature was the point. The guards knew. The warden's office had reports. But Rollins was careful about cameras and witnesses, and the institutional machinery moved slowly, especially when the man causing the problem had connections to 2 guards on the overnight rotation. Marcus paid the commissary tax like everyone else. He didn't make eye contact with Rollins. He read his Aurelius, ate his meals, served his time. Every morning in the northeast corner of the yard, 45 minutes before general population came out, he practiced. Not shadow boxing. Something slower. A series of deliberate, flowing movements, palm redirections, weight transfers, joint isolations done so slowly they looked decorative. A man moving through water. It was the most dangerous thing anyone in FCI Haverfield did between 6 and 7 in the morning. It just didn't look like it. The first comment came on Marcus's 3rd week. "What is that, yoga?" Rollins called from the bench press station. His crew laughed on cue. "You out here doing ballet, rookie? Stretching for the recital?" Marcus continued without acknowledgement. Rollins let it go the first week, the second. On the 3rd week, he crossed the yard and stood at the edge of the northeast corner, arms crossed, watching Marcus move through a slow palm, redirect with his head tilted like a man studying something he intended to break. "I think this man is soft," Rollins said to no one in particular. "Dancing because he's scared to train for real." Marcus stopped. He turned and looked at Rollins directly for the first time, with the same operational blankness that would later confuse and then unsettle the larger man, then turned back to his form and continued exactly where he'd left off. Rollins watched for 30 seconds. Then he walked away, slightly uncertain about something he could not name. Leo Castillo arrived at FC1 Haverfield in March, 22 years old, 140 pounds, eyes that hadn't adjusted to the specific texture of institutional fluorescent light yet. He had 3 years for a financial fraud charge that his lawyer had failed to adequately defend, a mistake made when Leo was 19 and barely understood what he was signing. He was a kid by every meaningful definition of the word, dropped into a system that did not make accommodations for kids. He lasted 4 days before Rollins's crew targeted him. It was the standard introduction, a shakedown in the cafeteria line, commissary items taken, compliance established, the cold welcome to the economy of C Block. Leo paid. He told no one. He moved through the days with the hunched, compacted posture of someone trying to occupy as little space as possible. Marcus noticed him on the 5th morning. The kid was standing at the far edge of the northeast corner, not quite watching, but oriented toward the place where Marcus practiced. Not approaching, not speaking. Just standing there with his hands in his jacket pockets, breathing in a way that was too deliberate to be natural, the controlled breath of someone managing panic. Marcus continued his form. The next morning, Leo was there again. Same spot, same careful breathing. On the 3rd morning, Marcus was 3 minutes into his practice when he heard, at the edge of his peripheral awareness, a very tentative attempt to copy one of the movements, a slow lift of one arm, a partial weight shift. Technically wrong, but the intention behind it, the specific reaching for stillness behind it, was something Marcus recognized from 11 years of watching frightened men learn to be calm under pressure. He said nothing. He slowed his own form by 10%. Leo's movement improved slightly. They went on like that for 2 weeks. No conversation, no formal instruction. Just proximity and the shared language of a man breathing slowly and a younger man trying to learn how to do the same thing. Word got back to Rollins. The quiet man in the northeast corner had a student. The student was the new kid, the scared little accountant with the soft hands. The Queen's Pawn had moved to the Knight's Square, and the King's Court had opinions about that. Rollins's opinion arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus was in the library, the single shelf of donated paperbacks that constituted FCY Haverfield's library, when he heard the sounds from the shower block down the corridor. He knew the sounds. He had heard similar sounds in other places, stripped of context, but structurally identical. The acoustics of a larger body applying itself to a smaller one in a confined space, the involuntary sounds a human ribcage makes when compressed by something it was not built to absorb. He was out of the library chair before the echo finished. He stopped himself at the shower block entrance. He stood there for 4 seconds. Inside, he could hear Leo making sounds that were very small and very frightened, and Rollins saying something in a low, satisfied voice that Marcus could not make out through the concrete wall. 4 seconds. 5. He took a very long breath. He let it out through his nose. He turned and walked back to his cell. He sat on his bunk with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them and stared at the floor. The vow. He had made the vow. He thought about why he had made it. He had made it because he was afraid of what he was. Because using what he knew felt like activating something that could not be turned off again. Because the last time he had used it, one night outside a bar in Atlanta in 4.5 seconds of pure reflex, it had cost him everything. He thought about Leo Castillo, 22 years old, 140 pounds, standing in the northeast corner of the yard, breathing too carefully because someone had to stand somewhere. He thought about what Aurelius had written, the passage he had returned to so many times the page had soft edges from his fingers, that a man who retreats to the proposition that he cannot help himself has already chosen his outcome. He sat there for a long time. In the infirmary, the duty nurse documented 2 fractured ribs, significant bruising across the left flank, and a hairline fracture in the orbital bone above Leo's left eye. Leo said he had slipped. The nurse noted it as reported. The forms were filed correctly. Nothing changed. Marcus visited during the 2-hour afternoon rec window. He sat on the plastic chair next to Leo's cot and said nothing for a long time. Leo's face was the particular purple-yellow of very fresh bruising. He was breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone who has learned that deep breaths cost something. "I'm sorry," Leo said finally. His voice was hoarse. "I know I shouldn't have been over there. I know it caused problems." "It didn't cause anything," Marcus said. "A man making a choice caused what happened to you. That's not the same thing." Leo looked at the ceiling. "Is he going to do it again?" Marcus looked at the back of his own hands. "No," he said. He said it the way a man states a fact that already exists, rather than a plan that is still forming. Leo looked at him. He didn't ask what that meant. There was something in the way it had been said that made asking feel unnecessary. Marcus stood up. He put his hand briefly on Leo's shoulder, careful, light, over the uninjured side. "Rest," he said. "I'll see you in the yard." He spent that night going through it. Not the techniques. Those lived in his body, not his mind, and they didn't require rehearsal. What he went through was the geometry, the angles. Rollins was 6'3", 250, a trained power striker with a low center of gravity and the reflexes of a man who had spent years in competitive environments. He would come forward hard. He would lead with his mass. He understood combat the way most fighters understood it, as a contest of force, with the larger force winning. That understanding was the vulnerability. You could not redirect what wasn't coming toward you. Rollins's confidence in his own mass was the thing that would undo him if the geometry was right. Not if Marcus was stronger. Not if Marcus was faster. If the angles were right. He had taught this principle to men who had eventually used it in places where the margin for error was absolute. He had made it simple. Do not oppose force. Borrow it. Redirect it. Return it. At 4 a.m, lying on his bunk with the block quiet around him, Marcus made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the conclusion of a long equation. He was done being quiet. The next morning, Marcus was in the yard at the regular time. His practice was the same, slow, meditative, geometrically precise. He stayed in his corner. He did nothing unusual. At 6:40, the main yard population began filtering in. Rollins's crew came through the west gate in their usual configuration. Rollins himself was last, the way men who own rooms always position themselves last. Marcus watched him cross the yard. Then Marcus walked away from his corner. He walked to the center of the concrete yard, the open, neutral ground that everyone tacitly understood as Rollins' territory, because Rollins' presence was always the center of whatever room he was in. 200 men, scattered across the yard in the loose configurations of morning routines, noticed. They noticed the way you notice the first crack of thunder before a storm. The sound itself is not yet the storm, but everything in your body knows that the air has changed. Marcus stood in the center of the yard with his hands open and his feet shoulder-width apart. He looked at Rollins. Rollins stopped. The yard went very quiet. 200 men scattered across the concrete in their morning configurations all felt the shift at the same time. Not a sound, not a signal, just the particular drop in ambient pressure that happens when something that has been building finally arrives. Rollins wasn't used to being approached. He was used to being orbited. The center of yard position, the open posture, the direct look. These were the behavioral signals of a challenge, and Rollins had not received a challenge in 3 years. His face did the thing faces do when something unexpected happens, a flicker of confusion rapidly plastered over with performance. "Dancer wants to play," Rollins said, for the room. The room did not laugh. The room was watching. "Yesterday," Marcus said, loud enough to carry, "you put a 22-year-old kid in the infirmary for standing in a corner?" He didn't say it with heat. He said it with the flat clarity of a man presenting a documented fact. 2 fractured ribs, orbital fracture, for standing in a corner. Rollins tilted his head. The performance recalibrated, not confused anymore, but calculating. He had to handle this publicly, correctly, with the authority of a man whose power depended on never appearing to need to justify himself. "You want to do something about that, rookie?" Rollins said. "Yes," Marcus said. Rollins did the assessment one more time, the same inventory Marcus had received from every man who had ever looked at him and failed to read what was there. 5'11", 190 pounds, no visible muscle tension, no fighter's guard, hands just hanging loose. A man waiting at a bus stop. Then he crossed the yard. He moved fast for a man his size. That had always been the thing that surprised people, the speed inside the mass. His opening move was a right-hand grab, direct and hard, aimed for Marcus's collar, the standard grip that preceded every dominant position Rollins used. Follow the grip with the body weight, pin, control, punish. Marcus let the hand come. At the moment, Rollins's fingers closed on fabric. Marcus rotated his left shoulder inward by 30 degrees and raised his left palm, not to block, to redirect. He made contact with the underside of Rollins's wrist at the exact moment that Rollins's mass was fully committed to the forward line. The physics were simple. 250 pounds of momentum on a fixed forward vector, meeting a palm surface angled at 15 degrees off that vector. Rollins's own weight carried him forward and down. His feet couldn't catch what his mass had already decided. He went into the concrete at a controlled angle. Not a fall exactly. More like a very large man being placed. The yard made a sound, not a cheer, something between a gasp and an exhale. Rollins was up fast. He had been down before, in cages, in sparring sessions, and his instinct under pressure was immediate reorientation. He turned. He processed what had happened and rejected the most obvious explanation. He had slipped. The other man had gotten lucky. Something. He came again with a combination. Left jab to set the range, right cross to land. Clean technique, the product of real training. Marcus stepped inside the jab, not around it, inside it, closing distance until the punch landed against his shoulder with a fraction of its intended force, the way you step into a door swing rather than letting it hit you at full extension. His right palm came up against Rollins's elbow. Light contact, 15 degrees of redirection applied at the joint at the precise moment the cross was throwing Rollins's shoulder forward. The shoulder kept going. The elbow didn't want to. Rollins made a sharp sound and stumbled sideways. He caught himself on one knee. The yard was completely silent. Rollins stood. His breathing had changed, not from exertion, but from something closer to the early stages of understanding. His mind was still refusing the understanding, but his body was beginning to receive it. He came a third time. Pure forward drive, arms spread, all mass and no technique, the kind of move that had worked his entire career, because his entire career had been built on the premise that his mass was insurmountable. Marcus sidestepped by 18 inches. He placed his left palm on Rollins's outer shoulder as the big man passed. He placed his right palm on Rollins's hip. He turned both palms inward by the same small increment and added nothing. No push, no force, just the geometric completion of the direction Rollins's own body was already traveling. Rollins hit the concrete yard a third time, harder, at a different angle. He lay there for 3 full seconds. 200 inmates stood in the morning yard of FCY Haverfield and did not make a sound. Rollins got up slowly, with the specific care of a man whose body is communicating new information and whose mind is still negotiating with it. He looked at Marcus from across a few feet of concrete. His hands were no longer raised in the fighter's guard he had carried into the yard. They hung at his sides. Marcus was standing exactly where he had been, hands open. Breathing slow. He had not thrown a punch. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved more than 3 feet in any direction. "We're done," Marcus said simply. It was not a question. It was not a threat. It was a statement delivered with the same tone as telling a man what time it was. Rollins looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face had gone quiet. The calculation behind his eyes, the constant running tally of power and status and position that had animated him for 3 years, had stopped producing useful numbers. He turned and walked back toward the west gate. His crew fell in behind him. They did not look at each other. The yard stayed quiet for a long beat after the gate closed behind them. Then slowly, in small increments, the morning noise returned. Men resumed their conversations, their card games, their circuits. The concrete was the same concrete. The sky was the same sky. But the center of the yard belonged to something different now. The warden's name was Hargrove, and he was the kind of corrections administrator who had learned to stop being surprised by what the security footage showed him. 22 years in federal corrections, he had seen most of what human beings did to each other in confined spaces. He watched the yard footage 3 times. The third time, he paused it on the moment of the third contact, the palm placement, the 18-inch sidestep, the geometric redirect that had put a 250-pound man on the ground without any apparent exertion. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the frozen image for a long time. He had not always been a corrections administrator. Before that, he had done 4 years as a military police officer, 2 of them at a post where he had cross-trained with a special operations unit on facility security protocol. He had watched men train who moved in a very specific way, quietly, geometrically, without waste. The man on his security footage moved exactly like that. He pulled Marcus Webb's file. He read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and made a call to a colleague at the Bureau of Prisons who had spent 20 years in military liaison positions before his current assignment. "I need you to look at a file," Hargrove said, "and I need you to tell me if you recognize the background." The colleague looked at the file. He recognized the background. 2 days later, a woman named Adaize Okonkwo arrived at FCI Haverfield. She was a military defense attorney with a 14-year record that included 3 wrongful conviction reversals, and she had been put on Marcus Webb's case by a veterans legal advocacy organization that Hargrove's colleague had quietly contacted. She sat across from Marcus in the visitor's room, a thin file folder on the table between them, and said, "Tell me everything about the night of March 14th, 4 years ago, in Atlanta." Marcus looked at her for a moment. He was not accustomed to being looked at by someone who appeared to be working on his behalf. "It won't help," he said. "The footage was corrupted. They documented it." "They documented it as corrupted," Okonkwo said. "There's a difference." She opened the folder. "Security cameras at a bar have backup systems. Most people don't know that. The bar's primary system was corrupted. Their backup cloud upload, triggered automatically at 15-second intervals, was not." She slid a still image across the table. "This was recovered from the backup server 48 hours ago." Marcus looked at the image. It showed a bar parking lot. A timestamp in the corner read 11:47 p.m., March 14th. In the center of the frame, 2 men could be seen approaching a third man from behind. The angle was slightly oblique, but the knife in the right hand of the closer figure was completely, unambiguously visible. Marcus looked at the image for a very long time. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he had stopped allowing himself to believe in. "The prosecutor," Okonkwo said, "had direct knowledge that this backup existed. His lead detective had access to it. We have the metadata trail. The decision to log the primary footage as corrupted without checking the backup was not an oversight." She said it carefully, clearly, with the precision of someone who had spent 14 years learning that how you said true things mattered as much as what you said. "Marcus, this case has been referred to the Attorney General's Office for Prosecutorial Misconduct Review. Your appeal has been fast-tracked. I need you to understand that when I say fast-tracked, I don't mean the system will move quickly. I mean I will move quickly inside the system, and I am very good at my job." Marcus was quiet. "How long?" he asked. "Best case, 6 months, possibly less. The backup footage is close to unimpeachable." Marcus looked out the small, high window of the visitor's room at the strip of sky visible above the prison wall. He had been looking at that same strip of sky for nearly a year. "6 months," he said. "Yes." He looked back at Okonkwo. What do you need from me? Everything you remember, every detail, starting from the moment you arrived at that bar. She uncapped her pen. Take your time. Marcus took a breath. He talked for 2 hours. He was right about Rollins. In the days after the yard, C Block changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow accumulating way that power structures change when the man at the top has been publicly revealed to be something other than what he claimed. The commissary collection stopped. The crew dispersed. The specific silence that had followed Rollins through the block like a weather system began to dissipate, replaced by the ordinary noise of men living in a difficult place without the overlay of constant low-grade terror. Rollins himself was transferred to a different block 3 weeks after the yard incident, following a formal complaint by 6 inmates that included documented accounts of extortion. The complaint had been filed because, in the wake of the yard incident, 6 men had concluded that Rollins's ability to make their lives worse in retaliation had materially diminished. Marcus did not file a complaint. He did not testify. He went back to his corner of the yard and resumed his practice. He had kept his vow for 11 months. He was not going to carry guilt about the morning he broke it. Aurelius had been clear about that too. Waste no time arguing about what a good man should be. B1. Leo Castillo was released from the infirmary on a Wednesday. He came to the yard the following Monday morning, moving carefully, favoring his left side. He stood at the edge of the northeast corner. Marcus glanced at him. He adjusted his starting position by 4 feet, opening more of the corner. Leo moved into the space. They practiced. No conversation. No formal instruction, just a man moving slowly through learned geometry and a younger man watching the shape of each movement and finding something in it that his body recognized as the opposite of panic. It was enough. The appeal decision came through on a Thursday morning, 5 months and 11 days after Adaizi Okonkwo had sat across from Marcus in the visitor's room. The Attorney General's office had moved on the prosecutorial misconduct findings faster than projected. The backup footage had been admitted as evidence and authenticated by 3 independent forensic teams. The prosecutor, a man named Garrett, had resigned under pressure 2 weeks prior. The detective who had logged the primary footage as corrupted had been suspended pending investigation. The language of the court order was precise. Wrongful conviction, full exoneration, immediate release. Hargrove delivered the news himself. He walked into Marcus's cell at 8 in the morning and handed him the document. Marcus read it standing up. He read it twice. He set it carefully on the bunk. "We'll process you out by noon," Hargrove said. "You can make calls before then." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for making the call." Hargrove shrugged slightly. "I have a good memory for how certain people move." He paused at the cell door. "What you did in that yard, I watched the footage a lot of times. You never lost your composure." "I've had good training," Marcus said. Hargrove left. Marcus sat on his bunk and picked up his Aurelius. He opened it to the passage with the soft-edged page, the one his fingers had found so many times in the dark that the paper had learned the shape of them. He read it one more time. Then he set the book on the bunk and began to pack. There was very little to pack. He walked out of FCY Haverfield at 12:17 in the afternoon into pale November sunlight and air that smelled like rain and exhaust and dead leaves and everything he had been carefully not thinking about for almost a year. Okonkwo was waiting in the parking lot. She handed him a paper bag that contained a phone, some cash, a change of clothes, and a turkey sandwich. "The exoneration's going to be in the news," she said. "Your name is going to be visible. Some people will want to talk to you." "I know," Marcus said. "Do you have somewhere to go?" He thought about it. He had been thinking about it for 5 months, in the specific way you think about things when you have time and very few distractions. "I have an idea," he said. 6 months later, the building on Albright Street in southwest Atlanta had been a laundromat, then a discount furniture store, then nothing for 2 years. The lease was cheap in the specific way that buildings in working neighborhoods with high foot traffic and no capital investment are cheap. Not because no one wanted the space, but because no one had shown up with a clear plan for it. Marcus showed up with a clear plan. He cleared it out himself over the course of 3 weekends. Swept it, painted it, laid out the kind of foam mats that cost more than everything else combined. He put no sign on the door for the first month. He simply left the door open on Saturday mornings and practiced in the space alone. People walked by. Some of them stopped to watch through the open door. Some of them came in. He called it Webb Community Martial Arts, not a dojo, not a gym, not a training center. Those words carried a specific freight that he wasn't interested in. A sanctuary, he had told Okonkwo when she'd asked. The word meant a place of protection. He was comfortable with that. The first student arrived on the 3rd Saturday, before Marcus had officially announced anything. Leo Castillo had been released 6 weeks prior, his own sentence reduced on appeal, and he had taken a bus from Houston to Atlanta on a Friday night specifically to be at the door of the space on Albright Street before Marcus opened the building. He was standing outside at 7:58 in the morning when Marcus arrived with 2 cups of coffee. Marcus looked at him. He hadn't lost the careful way of carrying himself that he'd developed in the yard, the slightly compressed posture, the habit of taking up less room than he had. But his breathing was easier. The managed panic rhythm was gone. "You're early," Marcus said. "I took the overnight bus," Leo said. "I didn't want to be late." Marcus handed him one of the cups. "Come in," he said. "We'll start with the basics." They walked into the building together. Marcus slid the door open, and the morning light came in across the clean foam mats. Leo put down his bag and turned to Marcus with a look that had something in it that Marcus recognized, the specific look of a person who has spent a long time in a very dark place and has recently, quietly, found a light. Not salvation, not rescue. Something smaller and more durable than either of those things. A direction. Marcus set his coffee down on the windowsill. He walked to the center of the mat. He raised his palms. "Watch my feet first," he said. "The movement starts there. Everything else follows." Leo nodded. He watched. Outside on Albright Street, a city moved through its morning, delivery trucks and early commuters, and the thin November light angling between the buildings. Inside, 2 men stood on clean foam mats, one showing and one learning, both knowing without saying it that what they were doing was more than form work. It was the thing they had each needed the most, in different ways and at different costs. A place to stand, a reason to be still. And the slowly accumulating knowledge that what you do with what you know matters more than what you know. Marcus breathed out. He began. Some lessons cost everything before they can be learned. And the men who carry the most dangerous knowledge are often the quietest ones, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've long since understood that real power never needs to announce itself. Marcus Webb knew what he was capable of. He spent a year choosing not to use it, and when he finally did, it wasn't for pride or dominance or any of the reasons the wrong men use force. It was for a 22-year-old kid standing in a corner, trying to learn how to breathe. That's the difference. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about quiet strength, real consequences, and the people who never announce what they're carrying. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't live to regret it, or witnessed a moment where the wrong person picked the wrong fight? Tell us what you saw.